welcome back to Spar and Brawl. I hope you're having a decent day. As always, I'm joined by my co-host Sam, and we're back with episode 2 of our Frankfurt School series. So if this is the first one that you're seeing, I highly recommend for you to go check out the first episode where we give a overview about what this Frankfurt School series entails and who we're going to talk about a bit more specifically and what the format is like. So you can check that out. And also this Frankfurt School series is quite different from the content that Sam and I usually do, which is always just based on us. So for this one, we've contacted and interviewed a bunch of professors. So again, a big thank you to them. And any of them who have already featured in our series, you can already go find their full interview. Again, links to those interviews are down below. I highly encourage you to do that as well, because we're just taking out some segments that go with the episodes for each of them. And one other thing to also bear in mind is that our conversations with our interviewees, the professors, were very much guided by our questions. So if they didn't discuss some topics as you think they should have, really the blame should we put to us. It's our fault. But with that out of the way, I'm just trying to think if there are any other housekeeping rules, Sam. Oh, and they will remerge any professors that you've seen previously or now, they will remerge again. So again, a big thank you to them. But besides that, please like and subscribe. And yeah, Sam, let's get episode 2 started. So episode 2 is kind of going to give a background to who influenced the Frankfurt School thinkers, especially the first generation, so such as Marx and Freud, which really influenced them heavily. But we're also going to talk about some other thinkers. Anything else, Sam, you think that we should mention before we get into episode 2?
No, I think, yeah, that was great.
All right, beautiful. So like and subscribe. So Sam, and again, we're just going to talk a bit now, just the two of us. So bear with us as we give our own little take and give a little overview of each thinker. And then we're going to share the interviews with you. So you can also find timestamps down below if you just want to skip everything that we're seeing and go straight away to the interviews, which include 2 big professors and interviewees in this area, Joel Whitebook and Martin J. But all right, Sam, with that now really out of the way, I think the first thing to talk about is Enlightenment, right? So I think that's kind of the only non-thinker but more idea that we're going to mention here, because
yeah, historical process, yeah.
Yeah. But I mean, yeah, because the other ones we kind of, we're going to go through one thinker after another and discuss their ideas. But here, just starting off with Enlightenment, and I think this is really Adorno and Horkheimer wrote most about this, and this is really the background. This is against what they were reacting, right? They weren't happy, let's say, the first generation of Frankfurt School thinkers, especially Adorno and especially Horkheimer, as you can read in their book Dialectic of Enlightenment. They really weren't happy with the ideas and the ways of thinking that Enlightenment has brought about. So for them, Enlightenment is really totalitarian, they say, because it just aims for mastery and domination. So domination over nature and the environment. And we had in our first episode, we had Professor Charles Mescalier touching on this a little bit, but then also domination over people. So for them, Enlightenment is only concerned with how to dominate nature, how to dominate people, and the way of thinking that came with it. So the scientific way, so to speak, it only looks at measuring things in a specific numerical way and putting values to it in a certain way that is possible with the scientific methods of the moment. And for them, really, this is perhaps the last point I'll make here, Sam, and then throw it back to you, is that Enlightenment was supposed to replace the previous set of thinking that was dominated by religion and which was supposed to be very myth-driven. But for them, Enlightenment is also very much based on a myth, the myth being that, we can find out the truth of everything and measure the truth of everything through scientific methods. So that is kind of my understanding of what their main criticisms of Enlightenment is. So I don't know if there's something that you'd like to add to that.
I would say I don't think it's just about the fact that it's a myth that we can understand. Well, the argument I think they're making is that, first of all, the idea that Enlightenment has this sort of a unique form of rationality that is superior and has its origins in logic and all that. They kind of disprove that. They prove that a lot of myths like religion and religious people and all that played a huge role in the process of enlightenment.
Mhm.
So that's just proving that the history that enlightened, a lot of enlightened people tell themselves, is just a fabrication. And then they also argue, as I think time goes by and stuff, enlightenment in itself becomes a myth as it
Mhm.
tries to like, yeah, tells itself that, yeah, we can, like, if you rationally think about things. And they mainly mean instrumental rationality that takes over all kinds of rationality.
Mhm.
So yeah, it becomes a myth in itself in a way. So
Exactly.
yeah, I would say I'll add this, that I don't think there's anything original. I mean, you
Mhm.
could argue Marx was kind of reacting to the same. Everybody was reacting to enlightenment, modernity, and its consequences, kind of. But what kind of separates them in a way was that I guess they tried to explain they tried to come up with a reasoning behind that through, I guess, through psychoanalysis and other disciplines. They try to come up with a reasoning behind why people accept that, or why people go along with that, or that type of thing, how that mechanism works. Because as we're going to discuss, there was a lot of people who had this very similar criticism
Mhm.
of enlightenment, contemporary and prior. But yeah, their unique sort of activities, like, or contributions, seem to have been the, yeah, incorporation of the individual and how that sort of plays the role in that, I would say. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. No. No. Very true. And we'll get to that more as as we move on from Marx to Freud right now in this episode. And yeah, and maybe one last thing I would add, and again, this is perhaps again, as you would say, not necessarily something very new and unique to them. I don't know. Previous thinkers could have possibly also come up with this, which is that they talk that how the reason, reason that comes with enlightenment is really just an instrument for economic reason and capitalism. So how we use it is always to that end and to that goal in capitalism. And sorry, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's, they were building on, I mean, Weber is the guy who
Mm-hmm.
comes up with that. So yeah, I mean, yeah, they seem to think it's inescapable. Well, at least Marcuse at some point thinks
Mm-hmm.
it's inescapable, but we'll see. Yeah.
Okay, let's
So
move on to
shall,
Marx
yeah,
quickly. I mean, for Marx, there's probably so much you can say because it's Marx. But I mean, I think we might keep it relatively short here, and then we're going to move on to Freud. And with Freud, we're also going to discuss a bit. But a lot of the video interviews that you're going to see in today's episode is around Freud. So again, we're not going to get too much into that. But with Marx, I mean, you can say just Marx was absolutely fundamental to them. Like, in fact, the school when it was originally put together and funding was came for it was to develop Marxist studies in Germany. So that's how much they were focused around Marxism, and a lot of the thinkers, Adorno, Horkheimer, all of these, and whoever else, they were all in one way or another. I guess you can consider them as Marxists. So but when Horkheimer became the dean, I forgot the director,
director.
of Frankfurt Institute after 6 or 7 years after he had Frankfurt School after it had opened. He's the one who pushed it more towards the kind of interdisciplinary integration, and he's really the one who pushed for psychoanalysis and for Freud to come into play. And I've been kind of reading that as time went on, they kind of moved away more and more from Marxism. Perhaps not that they moved away, but perhaps they discussed it more, maybe because they thought that Marx had already said a lot of the important things that were
It,
unique to him, and they were just complementing him with with this more
they discussed
interdisciplinary
it less,
approach.
I would say.
Yeah,
They
discussed it
discuss
less as they went
less.
from.
Oh,
Sorry,
you
did I
said
say
more.
more?
Okay.
No, less. Sorry. And yeah, let me just read this quote here from Claudio Corradetti, which we interviewed and who features in our first episode. Their starting point, so speaking of Frankfurt School, was the Marxian view on the relation between a system of production paralleled by a system of beliefs. Ideology, which according to Marx was totally explicable through the underlying system of production, had, for critical theorists, to be analyzed in its own respect as a non-economically reducible form of expression of human rationality. So they really wanted to complement what, for them, they were really looking to complement the work of Marx had done, or Marxism, and just go beyond the economic realm. And of course, then they, famously study the cultural industry and, the role that they play in maintaining the status quo, so to speak. So yeah, I don't know, Sam, if you would like to challenge any of that, add anything to that.
Add something. I mean, in our interviews, professors discussed this, but they did. So my view, personal view from reading them, is actually that it's really, as you say, it's kind of like they kind of take Marx for a given. So at the same time that Marx is heavily influential, they don't really talk about him that much, I find, relative to like they don't talk about, to be honest, too many people. They just talk about their own things. But yeah, I like, and they basically they argued that, I think this is part where I think it's good to give a bit of history, because Marx himself was I think a student of Hegel, who we're going to talk about, and then he moves to Britain, and he increasingly moves towards a more sort of an empiricist British style of sort of becoming a social scientist. So interestingly, these guys, Frankfurt School, who are in Germany, who are based in Frankfurt, who are students of Weber and Simmel, not Simmel, but Weber at some point, I think one of them. They argue that one, as in people should go back to get better understanding of how society works now. We should go back to early Marx writings, which is more Hegelian, so more ideologically sort of focused. And they argue that because, I mean, as time goes by, it becomes evident that revolutions or working class revolutions are not happening. So, and in fact, there is in 30s, they're a victim of rise of Nazis. So they see that instead of working class revolutions happening, there is a reactionarism that is happening. So they try to basically find justifications for that in their work. I mean, famously, they have Adorno has that book, Authoritarian Personalities and all that. Mm-hmm. So they were very much focused on the failings of, I guess, or lackings of Marx. Therefore, they are influenced by him, but they don't really reference to him so much or anything.
100%. And I guess for them, that's where Freud and psychoanalysis comes in, right? To explain.
Yeah. Why. I mean, for each one, a different set of influences. But yeah, with Freud being the big guy.
Yeah. Okay. Anything you want to mention about Freud? Because I mean, in the interviews we talk about extensively, so people can listen to what Joel Whitebook and Martin J have to say. But I don't know. Is there anything you think we should add here?
I don't know. I mean, Freud is. I am very conflicted personally on him, because I kind of find like a lot of things he says make sense to me, but I can't really justify it to anybody else. So it does. I definitely think they are more influenced by Freud than Marx, though. Even in terms of like the things they do, like art criticism and art analysis and all that. I don't know. It just, yeah. And I have the same feeling about a lot of Frankfurt School writers. Who was I reading the other day? I forget, one of the major three one. I think it was Adorno. And yeah, you agree with a lot of the stuff he says, but it does feel like a opinion piece. It doesn't feel like a academic piece. You know what I mean? Like, so Freud is similar in that sense. But yeah, I think, although I think the way they use Freud really elevates Freud, I must say that. I don't know what you think. But because Freud himself, whenever Freud used his own theory, Jesus Christ, he came up with some really, really stupid idea.
Yeah, and they also make major criticisms of Freud. I mean, I don't know Freud well enough to understand the criticism, perhaps, but in Eros and Civilization, Herbert Marcuse is making a criticism of Freud at the same time as he employs him heavily, if I understand him correctly. So it's not that they agreed necessarily with everything the way that Freud saw, but it really seems like, and now I understand why people, I think it's Joel Whitebook and Esther Leslie was also saying that Frankfurt School for them is really the first generation, and it's really Horkheimer, Adorno, Marcuse, and then you can add a few of the other ones, Benjamin and others around it, because I think their real, I don't want to say obsession, but them looking at psychoanalysis so much and them relying on Freud so much for explaining society and the world, I think stops with them. And if I'm not mistaken, once they reach into Habermas and all this, he's moved on from Frankfurt School. And again, like Claudio Corradetti said, the way for making the line of connection for all these people is just kind of start thinking about critical theory as a movement and not necessarily Frankfurt School, and perhaps not even so much about Freud and Marx at that point, perhaps.
To be honest, yeah, I think it should. It should be viewed, I think, as a German really tradition, because it's sort of they pick up where Freud and Weber, and Freud I know wasn't German, like I don't know, well, he was Austrian, I assume, because he worked in Vienna, but I don't know. Yeah, it does, yeah, and they continue that. Although I like to, just for historic, because we want this show to have some level of like purpose for people. Erich Fromm was the guy who really was the psychoanalyst guy of the school, and apparently he educated everybody else on the matter. Even like he would give them lectures and stuff, and he goes on to leave this school and in fact goes to France and then sort of focuses more on psychoanalysis, somewhat less relevant today apparently than he was huge in 60s and 70s. But yeah, I agree. I mean, yeah, it should be viewed as an evolving tradition, I would say. And yeah, each person adds his own thing and does his own thing pretty much. So yeah, you're right. They like the most recent ones have put Freud aside somewhat, and we're going to talk about them. But Habermas, Honneth, and stuff, I don't think they rely on Freud too much as I mean, in one of our interviews, we discuss how basically Habermas sort of puts Freud aside, basically. So, but yeah, very crucial figure in their history, I would say.
But okay, so Marx
by the way,
Freud,
we forgot to mention, we probably include the part of the interview with Alan Esket that is a criticism of Freud and Marx in this video or the next one, as a sort of, so there will be some criticism of at least Freud and Marx. We couldn't find any of the other ones, but yeah.
Definitely. And but I mean, in our questions, especially as we moved on with the interviews, we tried to put out more and more kind of critical and challenging questions as much as we could. But then we're interviewing people who know 500,000 times more about the subject than us. So I mean, I don't even know if they're too fruitful, but we tried our best to play devil's advocate as much as possible. But all right, Sam.
There was a lot of gotcha questions about the personal life of Adorno. Was he truly?
But okay, Sam. So Marx and Freud are really like the pillars of Frankfurt School, especially for those first few generations. So putting them aside, do you want to, or do you still have things to say about them? If not, we can move on to kind of the more secondary thinkers who influenced them as well.
No, that's the thing. I kind of want to challenge that view in a way that I don't think I don't really, especially from reading them, I don't think they are the most important influences on these people. Like, I think, Weber, I think, is more influenced. Like, I mean, come on, like Horkheimer and Adorno are far more influenced by Weber and instrumental rationality, Iron Cage of Bureaucracy.
But Marcuse, for instance, when you read Eros and Civilization, I mean, it just reads like something that a Marxist would write. But that's perhaps because, I don't know, things that have to do with the capitalist system and people working, and that kind of immediately makes you think of Marx.
I mean,
so he kind of dominates that kind of view and thinking.
No, but that's because Marxism is more famous than Weberism. Because if you read Weber, no, seriously, because if you read Weber, because Weber and Marx were pretty much writing in the same tradition as well. They were all writing very similar things. And in fact, I would argue if anybody's written Protestant Ethics by Weber and the rise of capitalism. I forget the exact title. That's far closer to works of Adorno, Horkheimer, and
Okay, very
I've
interesting.
read Marcuse far less. Marcuse, I mean, it's literally about how, for example, an ideology like Protestant ethics interacts or gives rise to capitalism.
Mm-hmm.
So I think Weber is by far I'm surprised at how I feel like Weber is a far more crucial person in there, even though they might agree with Marx in terms of economic understanding a bit more in their style, in their application of social sciences, in their even general outlook. It seems to be, and by the end of their lifetime, by the way, just like Weber, they kind of become liberals. So
I see. I mean, perhaps Marx, you can also say it's because of the fact that he's so associated with Frankfurt School. Is, like I said, the school was, for instance, literally developed to study Marxism in Germany. And also they kind of starting from the point where it seems like, okay, Marx said this and that, and there should be a revolution now. Why hasn't happened? Let's kind of reverse engineer it a bit. So I guess Marx is just kind of central in that sense to their narrative too. But yeah, you're kind of saying once you start looking at at really what they're writing, it's closer perhaps to even Weber, or you can also see Weber's influence, which is understated to an extent, perhaps. I think I've said perhaps a million times
I
so
mean,
far today. I'm going to stop saying perhaps going forward, perhaps.
maybe. Perhaps I'm gonna stop. No, I mean, I don't know if it's. I mean, I don't. I'm not sure if it's understated by themselves. I haven't read enough to say that, but yeah, I would. It is, I guess, because Marxism is more popular, and it makes sense because Weberism is far more of a just analysis rather than a, Marxism famously says, it wants to change the world, right? But yeah. And the obsession they have with authoritarian personalities, very similar to Weber's idea of like a charismatic leader and his sort of writing. And I also like to point out that, for example, at some point, apparently Max Horkheimer sort of not kicks out, but sort of exiles Habermas to a different institute because he considers him to be a slightly too Marxist. So they have a problematic, or at least there is ups and downs in the relationship with Marx.
Yeah, that's so actually made me think of two things perhaps that worthwhile mentioning here. I think also methodologically speaking, they were very much influenced by Weber, right? I mean, perhaps you could also say the same thing of Marx,
I think so, yeah.
But moving away from like positivism to more like this kind of constructivism of ideal types, it seems so. Kind of, that's one thing.
When they go back to early Marx, they're going back to German Marx, which was the one influenced by Hegel, and Weber was in the same sort of, they were all part of the same sort of system. Not that they were exactly taught by the same people or anything, but yeah, I agree. I think their methodology is far more Weberian than Marxist, or at least what is orthodox Marxist called Marxist.
And yeah, and the Habermas thing, I can't remember who it was in which interview, maybe Claudio Corradetti, but yeah, I think Horkheimer wasn't a fan of.
Gordon mentioned it.
Gordon too, yeah, they weren't the fans of Habermas, really, especially Horkheimer. Apparently, he sent him away twice, once to finish like his post-PhD kind of thesis and once to teach. And I think they really made fun of his
lecture,
his kind of medical condition a lot or something, apparently. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah, but I think so. Somebody said this. Maybe I'm mistaken, but I'll find a clip if that's the case.
Man.
So yeah, they weren't fond of him at first, but then I guess they realized that he is.
They made him
a genius.
They made him carry their books.
Oh, yeah. True.
That's so weird. Max Horkheimer used to make Habermas carry his books. That is. I mean, that was so. I mean, and they want to talk about authoritarian personality. Like, look in the mirror, but
no, I mean, Horkheimer is like one of those guys. I feel like he can't be accused of being like hippie, wishy-washy, like kind of guy.
None of them.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the best. I mean, these days, a lot of people who love these guys and stuff, they're associated with the left and free love and all that, especially, I guess, because of Marcuse's writing. But especially Adorno and Horkheimer were not
Yeah.
for anything like clean your room, you go to bed at 9. Did you eat your vegetables? All of them.
And Adorno, the way he would dress, I can just imagine
Oh
him
yeah,
dressing like
Adorno.
somewhere between like a high-end banker, like slash like the CEO of a fashion company or something, like
Yeah,
a blend of the
like
two. His
Italian.
pictures
Yeah,
amazing. His pictures online are amazing. He has some of like the best pictures. I guess he went out there and asked people to take all these awesome
he
pictures
no,
of
he
him, but
he
they're
clearly put
amazing.
effort.
Yeah.
He clearly put effort in the hair, and
Yeah.
I mean,
He's not the
it's
academic
so
where they tell
funny.
him to like show up for a picture and he's like, like, like
Yeah,
half
or
dead looking.
no, he's wearing
Yeah.
he's wearing a cardigan with a coffee cup in it. No, he's very well dressed. He's got a fucking cravat on
Yeah.
and everything. Yeah, he's very no. He was not somebody who would enjoy hanging out with a lot of people on the left. Getting angry at him. But yeah, it's just, I mean, the bits, I mean, I'm gonna read the expert on when we get to our episode, I think, about Adorno, but his whole correspondence with Marcuse about the student movements in Germany is some of the funniest things. I mean, he used to dress up, literally dress up, go to museums and zoo and just walk around reflecting. I mean,
Hey man,
Jesus Christ.
what a life.
What a life. What a life.
I agree. I think he knows what, yeah.
Well, he knows what a good life is.
Yeah,
You
no,
have to give him that.
Adorno knows. But okay.
Going to a zoo reflecting. Is the
let's
monkey happy?
let's keep this going, Sam. So let's continue. Hegel and Weber, is there more that you want to talk about them here? Or if not, let's mention a few other thinkers who were influential.
Well, no, just to finish off on Hegel, I think Hegel is a really interesting one because it's sort of, it also sparks Adorno's negative dialectics, which is Hegel has this theory, which is not, I mean, people who are Hegel experts tell me that it's not actually dialectics, it's actually like a triad is sort of methodology, but it's similar to a dialectics and it's popularly referred to as dialectics. So for the sake of the arguments, we just go with dialectics here. But his argument is that there's these ideas, and these ideas. First, there's many. He has many ideas, obviously, and from reading Frankfurt School, I like. It seems that they are trying to respond to idealism of Hegel, but not in the way that Marx responded to it, but making it materialistic. And so it has the deterministic aspects. If you accept certain, because Hegel has been like interpreted it more different ways than goddamn Bible. So it's just, depends on who you believe. So if you accepted that very traditional simplistic view of Hegel as a sort of he believes in absolute ideals and history is sort of evolutionary progress, blah, blah, blah. Marx makes that materialistic. These guys see the flaws with Marx's sort of materialistic system, so they try to go back to Hegel, but try to criticize him within sort of theory and all that. And that's the part, to be honest, I don't understand a lot about. And because sometimes I don't understand if they're, I mean, if I was reading that Adorno was trying to criticize the humanism and the idealism of Hegel, and his negative dialectics is in a way anti-systematic, is an anti-system system, because it's about the fact that if through dialectics and through rational inquiry, we realize that basically our knowledge is limited and we can't understand the thing, if there is a thing. While Hegel was saying that if through rational sort of progress or collective, whatever it is, we do get a better understanding. So from like when I read it like that, I really like it. I kind of like their criticism of Hegel. But if they do believe in an absolute idea, as in the absolute ideas, as in I don't know, that sort of comes in conflict with my materialism, I feel, and yeah, it's very complicated.
I see.
That's all I'm saying.
Yeah, too complicated for me to honestly add much.
Yeah, I must say, like, they look, theoretically they were responding to failures of Marxism, Soviet Union, and then you had sort of a structuralism and then post-structuralism, and they were in the middle of that. They Frankfurt School. And I must say, in terms of theoretical sort of understanding, and maybe that's because I kind of don't understand what they're saying basically, but like similar, like their attack on positivism is not the most appealing to me personally. I think like Thomas Kuhn's sort of attacks Paul Feyerabend, sorry, the guy who talks about sort of epistemological anarchism, or even Michel or Michael, I never learned that, Polanyi, their attacks on positivism, in my view, is more understandable. These guys' attacks on positivism and on idealism of Hegel and all that is just really confusing. That's the part where I sort of agree with their critics that they're writing. It can be very confusing. So, like, not so much when they are doing art criticism and all that, but here it's, again, that may be just because me, like most people, we're just very stupid about like theory and all that. It's too many very big words. And
yeah, I mean, the positivism criticism, I'm not going to deny that perhaps there are better and more clear-cut ones out there, but I mean, I understand their criticism of positivism, or at least I project my understanding of it onto them, one or the other. But in any case, kind of end in the same ground, which in the same area, which I feel like I agree with them. But yes, some of their stuff can be a bit tough to read, some less. And I've said before, a lot of political philosophers can be hard to read. But I just told you the other day, I stumbled upon something funny. I went to read an article on dialectic of enlightenment. I think it was written by a professor, someone who was supposed to be educational, kind of explaining it. And out of the whole book, he's like, okay, I mean, the book is a bit complicated and all that, so we're just going to go to the chapter on the cultural industry. That's much more understandable. I was like, well, thank you. I've read that, and even by myself, I managed to kind of
that's when I kind of understood.
Yeah. And the first chapter and the Enlightenment part, I read it, and I think I kind of get some stuff, but in between, from chapter 1 until the culture industry, it becomes a bit harder, and that's where we think you need someone to explain you and guide you through it to understand better what they're saying exactly.
Yeah, and I must say, even like a lot of the stuff they say, like, why do you need to talk about Oedipus's? I mean, I don't get it. Sometimes it's very weird. It's very weird, but it definitely comes from a specific, I think, what can be recognized as a specific German tradition. Like Freud talks about, I mean, they were influenced by Freud, so that's not surprise, but that's the whole point of a tradition. But the same Greek guys, they all talk about and all that.
Yeah.
Interesting.
But okay, so much Adorno. So we're gonna have a full episode on Adorno anyway.
All right. So now from Hegel, I thought this is a good place to segue to more philosophical influences of Frankfurt School. And I think this is an area that has been relatively, it's not part of like mainstream, I guess, understanding of Frankfurt School. But I personally thought there is some parallels between sort of Nietzsche, Kierkegaard. I mean, Nietzsche is pretty explicit, but Kierkegaard and Spinoza maybe to a lesser extent as well. So we're going to focus on that. And I came across this interesting thing. This is from Adorno in a lecture from 1963. To tell the truth, of all the so-called great philosophers, I owe Nietzsche the greatest debt, more even than to Hegel, which is quite interesting because I think even though they are like, whenever he's writing as he's referring back to Hegel and all that, I do feel like they're closer in philosophy to Nietzsche, Kierkegaard, or Spinoza, in a sense that, they don't have a, like, I feel like they don't have a belief in an absolute ideal or a God or a collective unconscious or connection between all things. I don't know. What do you think?
I see. So that's why, because Hegel kind of sees as not that everything is connected, but that there's like in each era there's like kind of one kind of spirit, geist, or like way of thinking that permeates all of humanity. Is that what you're kind of referring to?
Can you say
Or did I
that?
misunderstand you? Because you said it seems to be more closer to Nietzsche as rather than Hegel, because they kind of don't think that there is one
Oh
uniform
yeah,
way of
I thought
thinking that
I thought you said
guides.
they think.
Oh,
Yeah,
no,
all
they
right,
don't
yeah.
think. And based on my very little understanding of Hegel, which is so little, it's literally based on a Michael Sugru video and
Lecture, yeah.
lecture. In it, I think one of the things that I got from it is that Hegel kind of said that, each period has like its own Geist, which is like its own spirit, which pretty much means like a way of thinking. That's as far as my understanding goes. So I just thought maybe you're referring to that.
No, yeah, pretty much. I agree that yeah, that's the thing. I mean, there is more skepticism in them than sorry, in them than in Hegel, I think. So that's why I think it puts them closer to Nietzsche than Hegel in terms of philosophy. But I guess Nietzsche, unlike Hegel, I mean, the thing about Hegel, from again what I've read, as like you, I don't understand Hegel at all, or very little. He had a system. Nietzsche didn't really have. I mean, didn't there was not so much of a systematic thing, so it was hard, I guess, to maybe respond to, or as a social scientist to work with Nietzschean thing. Although in both in dialectics of enlightenment and in Minima Moralia, the Adorno book, they do mention Nietzsche, and for example, I think Adorno talks about melancholy sciences, which is a reference to gay sciences from Nietzsche and all that. So there is definite clear references as well.
Okay, so and we didn't get to really put any of these questions to many of the professors for these thinkers that we're discussing right now. So too much from what I recall. So if any of you also have some questions that we're not answering, or some criticisms and everything, please make sure to leave them down below, and we won't answer them. But if there's a good bunch throughout this series, we can always contact one of the many professors who are so kind with their time and just put the questions to them and get a response from them. So please feel free to add so in the comment section.
Yeah. And just before we finish off on Nietzsche, Kierkegaard, I mean, that's what I read in an article about Kierkegaard's influence on Frankfurt School. It's from a book, Kierkegaard and Critical Theory by Marcio Morgan. I think that's the main point, that the reason why Kierkegaard and Nietzsche feel more compatible with Frankfurt School than Hegel, I think, is because they kind of put the individual very much at the center of their thinking. I mean, the parts that are at least famous and commonly read. I mean, Kierkegaard was a religious man, but it's all about the leap of faith and individual life and all that. And I mean, Kierkegaard, famously a massive sad boy who was always like melancholic and angry. So it kind of, that in that way as well, it feels very much at home with Frankfurt School.
I see.
Which is focusing on individual, or at least people's relationship with systems, ideological.
Especially with the psychoanalysis part, I guess. Yeah, you could say.
Yes.
Obviously. That was the most obvious statement to
no,
follow what you had just said. But yeah.
I don't know. No, actually, I think it was good. No, I don't know. It was a good sort of cap it off. Tire.
Yeah.
Well, all right. So let's move on to last set of people I wanted to talk about, who are two or three people. I don't know if we really talk about Tonis too much, but it's Georg Simmel, George Herbert Mead, and Ferdinand Tonis. I never know how to pronounce his name rightly. So two Georges and a Ferdinand. So that's what you got here. So I think Georg Simmel really, you could argue, I think he even had more influence on them. Not influence, maybe they didn't read his work, I have no idea. but his work feels like a very much a prosecutor to their work. I mean, he wrote famously work this. Uh, he has this work, the Metropolis and Mental Life. He was he was he knew Weber. I don't know if they were friends or not. And the way, for example, he writes about modern life and the Metropolis, I feel like he's very much, and the effect it has on individual is very similar to how Frankfurt School
I
talks about
see.
things and all that. Yeah, very, very similar. So sorry, do you want?
No, I said I see. I see. Yeah. No, yeah, I'm
And very
really not
much,
familiar with his reading, so I can't really add.
all right. And he's very much focused on the conflict, on that type of thing within society, although not exclusively. You could argue Simmel is sort of, not that Adorno exclusively was negative, but Simmel is sort of between Benjamin and Adorno in a way.
Mm-hmm.
So you've got him. You've also, by the way, he also talks about instrumental rationality and how in modern life that plays a role. You also got Ferdinand Tönnies, who came up with ideas of Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft, community and society. Community being the nice, good one where most people know each other,
Mm-hmm.
and society is ruled by a form of rationality that is not instrumental rationality. But then you got the society, which is largely instrumental rationality, largely like exchange of money, not personal relationships. So I think definitely Tönnies, who I am very little familiar,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I'm
Yeah.
not as familiar. Yeah, he had an influence on their thinking as well. And sorry, we talked about Simmel
So many
and
interesting people to just
Tönnies.
explore
Yeah,
by
exactly.
themselves.
And
Yeah.
but I think what it was interesting was also looking at George Herbert Mead. Sorry, I'm just looking for I can't find it. Oh, found it. George Herbert Mead, interestingly, you could argue, according to some of the articles I read, that he's has more influence on the later generations, on
Okay.
Habermas and yeah,
Let's not forget about the later
yeah,
generation.
yeah, Habermas and Axel Honneth, yeah, who is the after Habermas. So this is just from the abstract that uh, it argues that Herbert Mead was again, all these people, by the way, that I'm all talking about Germans. You could argue they've all shared this sort of largely anti-positivist
Mm-hmm.
sort of bent, and Herbert Mead was a pragmatist. And the author here, Ricardo Fabrino Mendonça, argues that in two turns, Herbert Mead influenced the Frankfurt School. If the first generation of the Frankfurt School was averse to American pragmatism, it became central to subsequent generations of critical theories. Mead's writing is one of the bases of Habermasian theory of communicative action. It is also the core of Honneth's notion of recognition. The objective of this article is to reconstruct the reinterpretation of Mead's work developed by these two philosophers.
Wow,
So
extremely interesting.
as we can see, like as time goes by, different critical theories, as we discussed earlier, have different influences, have uh, different interests, even, or that type of thing. So I thought it was worth mentioning these three people because, first of all, they did contribute to their outlook, I think. Secondly, I think because it sort of helps with my main thesis that this is a very much a German influenced sort of a school of thinking, or
Yeah.
very, very much German. Yeah.
I mean, does seem so based on the people that we've mentioned so far. But then again, could you say that in Europe, a lot of thinkers were German? Well, no, right? I mean, the French had a big tradition that kind of follows that. And
You can,
perhaps the British
but
one.
yeah, I mean, you could argue it's quite funny that, yeah, even social scientists or supposedly free thinkers and all that, when you they do seem to, like, you could argue that, yeah, French philosophers share certain, at least certain stylistic sort of characteristics, if not necessarily content.
Okay, all right, brilliant stuff. So is it time to pass it on to to our interviewees and let them kind of talk a bit more in detail some of the folks that we mentioned so far?
Yeah, I think so.
All right, so let's do that.
When Leo Lowenthal, who was one of the major figures of the first generation, wrote to Horkheimer and asked him what the role of psychoanalysis was in critical theory, Horkheimer wrote back and said, it's essential, it's one of our building blocks. So I would argue that along with Hegel, Marx, and Max Weber, Freud, in fact, represents one of the foundation stones or building blocks of critical theory. While the critical theorists of the first generation were Marxists, they were Marxists of a very heterodox sort. And that heterodoxy, you might say, is what led them to Freud, for a theoretical reason and for a practical reason. Theoretically, they were opposed to the sort of objectivism or reductionism of orthodox Marxism, which reduce superstructure to base, consciousness to economic factors, and so on and so forth. Which is to say, they were bothered what is often referred to as the lack of the subjective dimension, the anti-psychologism of orthodox Marxism. So one reason they turned to psychoanalysis was to correct that fact. I should go back, another historical point. The Frankfurt School was the first group of university philosophers and social scientists to take Freud seriously, which was quite a radical thing to do at the time in a German university, given the conservatism of German university, given the fact how scandalous Freud was and that he was a Jew. And the relationship between the analyst in the critical theorist in Frankfurt and the analyst was quite intimate. They actually shared the same building, they shared the same classrooms, they co-sponsored talks where they brought in some of the most eminent psychoanalysts of the day, Anna Freud, for example. And Max Horkheimer sat on the board of directors of both the Institute for Social Research and the Frankfurt Psychoanalytic Institute. And another figure who bridged both schools was Erich Fromm, who was a trained psychoanalyst and also a critical theorist. And in fact, it was he who educated the other members of the Institute about psychoanalysis. So that aside, let me get back to my narrative. So the theoretical motive for incorporating psychoanalysis into critical theory was, as I said, the lack of a subjective dimension in orthodox Marxism. But then certain political and historical factors entered in, which led them to take up psychoanalysis in their research. The major one was the fact that during the 30s, during a period of economic crisis, which Marxism would have predicted would have produced a socialist revolution or the radicalization of the proletariat, in fact, turned in the opposite direction and became conservative and fascist. So they wanted to use psychoanalysis to understand why this happened. And the result of that project, of that undertaking, was a study called Authority in the Family, which was one of perhaps the first research project which took up psychoanalysis to try and understand political, economic, and political phenomena like that. At the time, they were using a relatively conventional concept of psychoanalysis and explain the reactions of the German working class in terms of ego structure, obsessive compulsiveness, and so on and so forth. Later on, they'll take up a more radicalized version of it. So then when they were in exile in the States, in fact, when Horkheimer and Adorno were in Los Angeles, two things happened. They got news, they received news that the Nazis were putting the final solution into launching it, pursuing it. It had begun. And at the same time, they received news that their friend and colleague, Walter Benjamin, had committed suicide trying to escape the Gestapo. And this led to an enormous emotional and theoretical crisis on their part, which led them to the conclusion that they had to radicalize their position. I know Martin J. probably talked about this with you. So whereas before, they were still pursuing something like the critique of political economy, although in a very heterogeneous and sophisticated war, they realized that they had to radicalize their critique, and they took up the domination of nature as the central theme of the dialectic of enlightenment. And part of the, one major dimension of the dialectic of enlightenment was the Freudian dimension. And their basic thesis in the dialectic of enlightenment was that the domination of external nature and the domination of internal nature mutually entail one another. And in order to dominate the external world, human beings had to turn themselves into what they say, purposive, reified agents. So that's where Freud came in. But now it wasn't the Freud, the more conventional Freud. It was the more controversial Freud of the late cultural writings. Most importantly, Civilization and Its Discontents. I mean, I could continue, but I don't know. The dialectic of enlightenment led to a, I dislike the word, but for lack of a better word, to a very pessimistic evaluation of the historical and political situation. It led to the thesis of what they called a totally administered world. And then Marcuse, who was one of their colleagues, took the thesis of a totally administered world, or the dialectic of enlightenment, and concretized it in his book, One-Dimensional Man, which was sort of an empirical concretization of this more abstract argument, pessimistic argument about, which was referred to as a totally administered world. And this was both the thesis of the totally administered world and the thesis of the dialectic of enlightenment reflected the fact that the members of the first generation concluded that after the Second World War, when one could no longer assume that the proletariat was an agent of social revolution, when in fact the working class was being co-opted and incorporated into the welfare state, they saw the possibility of a radical transformation of society as being practically nil. But the interesting thing is, Marcuse wrote One-Dimensional Man in the 60s, right before all hell was about to break loose with the New Left and the Cultural Revolution. But the other interesting thing is, in the 50s, in the height of the McCarthy era, in the height of the social conservatism of the States, in the height of the Adenauer era in Germany, he wrote Eros and Civilization. Mm-hmm. And in Eros and Civilization, he tried to show, as he said, it was a purely philosophical argument, purely theoretical argument. He wasn't making any empirical claims, but he wanted to show that the idea of a non-repressive society, which is the Freudian name for utopia, is possible, and that it could be demonstrated through an immanent critique of Freud himself. In a way, he wanted to stand Freud on his head and take the arguments of a deeply pessimistic book like Civilization's Discontents and read them in such a way that they showed that, at least theoretically, a non-repressive or utopian society was possible. Now, Adorno was very skeptical about this sort of utopianism. They were, Horkheimer and Adorno were unwilling to go that route. Well, Marcuse in the 50s posited as a theoretical possibility. And then when the New Left broke out in the late 60s in the counterculture, he argued that what he had demonstrated was a theoretical possibility in the 50s was now being enacted and realized, at least the rudiments of it were being enacted and realized by the radical movements of the 60s. And he became a very enthusiastic supporter of the New Left and the Cultural Revolution, although he had his reservations. And in this, he was took a very different path than Adorno. And in fact, there's a series of letters between them, which you can see in they're published in the New Left Review about the 60s, where, I think Adorno and the others kind of think that Marcuse had lost it and flipped out and became too enthusiastic. So then with the end of the New Left and with the decline of the movements in the 60s, Marcuse sort of faded into the past. And as the world became more conservative, as the 68 spirit seemed to be, how should I put it? Seemed to have been a myth. That was the point in which Habermas appeared on the scene, who became the leader of the second generation. Now, Habermas's approach and sensibility was much different than the first generation. I should say that the first generation, and especially Marcuse, were quite suspicious of German social democracy. They had all come of age at the time of the First World War, when the SPD, rather than opposing the First World War, rather than joining up with the international proletariat, voted for war credits. And then the SPD was also complicitous in the murder of Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht. And for Marcuse especially, that was a decisive experience. But not just he, but I would say all of them were colored by that experience with the SPD. And while they refused to embrace, with the exception of Marcuse, a revolutionary position, they were also skeptical of social democracy. Habermas's sensibility was very different. First of all, his biography was different. The older members were practically all Jewish. Most of them had to leave the country. So the Holocaust, Auschwitz, exile formed their sensibility. Habermas came of age during the Nazi period and witnessed it. And when it ended, I would say at the center of his concern was the formation of a democratic society in the Federal Republic in West Germany. And that had consequences for his theory. He considered himself a radical liberal or radical reformist. And he rejected the idea of revolution, and he both advocated radical reform and thought that it was possible. and the premise of that was that the destructive sides of capitalism could be contained. So he developed a much different theory. He had a much different sensibility. He had much different priorities, and he developed a much different theory. And also, he thought that the old German philosophy of the great figures like Heidegger were somehow tied up with the Nazi past. So he wanted to turn to analytic philosophy, other philosophical traditions, and sort of bring German philosophy into the contemporary world. So in the beginning, in Knowledge and Human Interests, it's still a transitional book. So he's got his one foot in the camp of the old Frankfurt School, and the other he's moving towards his communication theory and his linguistic philosophy. So while it's a very important, the last 3 chapters are a very important study of Freud. You can already see in them the roots that will cause him to move away from Freud. The most important one being that he argues that the unconscious is linguistic. For Freud, the main difference between consciousness and the unconscious was between a non-linguistic domain and a linguistic domain, which means the self was essentially split. It was a conflictual theory. Habermas, and he was motivated to do this partly by his interest in the philosophy of language, which was current at the time, argued that the unconscious was already linguistic or proto-linguistic. So while he engaged Freud in Knowledge and Human Interests, the seeds for his moving away from Freud were already there. And it wasn't too long after that that he gave up Freud and he moved to the cognitive theories of Lawrence Kohlberg and Jean Piaget. So one of my ongoing themes has been to criticize what I consider Habermas's domestication of psychoanalysis or flight from psychoanalysis, which I think is tied up with some of the political and philosophical problems with his position. And I won't go into, and I would say this, I'd say the same thing applies mutatis mutandis to the work of Axel Honneth.
What would you make of accusations of his work perhaps lacking scientific basis? What would you make of that? And then I believe you elaborate a few of your own critiques on Freud, but if you want to add a few, go ahead, son.
Yeah, like what do you say to critics that they say there must be a cognitive basis or biological basis for all the explanations of mind's activities? So that's the biggest, I guess, criticism of Freud. And yeah, after that, if you could just say because I just started reading your biography of Freud, and you have your own criticisms, but I haven't really read it properly to be able to say anything. So I thought maybe you could put them in a nice little thing for us.
Look, Freud was a physician. Freud started out as a neurologist. Freud cut up thousands of brains. Freud in no way denied that the psyche or consciousness had a material base. I mean, he was not an idealist, he was a materialist. The question is, what's the relationship, as they put it today, between brain and mind? And, with the fashionableness of neuropsych, everybody has a rather ambitious program, or I won't say everybody, there's a tendency which has an ambitious program that mind is going to eventually be reduced to brain. I mean, with the discovery of the brain imaging equipment, the neuropsychologists have become very, very ambitious. They say that the imaging equipment is to them as the telescope was to Galileo. And they're finally going to be able to solve all the questions about the brain and maybe mind and brain, which I think at this stage is a very, very premature claim and overly ambitious. As for the scientific status of psychoanalysis, I mean, one thing that we have to give Habermas credit for, and we also have to give Paul Ricoeur credit for, who wrote his Freud and philosophy at the same time as Habermas wrote Knowledge and Human Interest, is that they both provided very, very sophisticated critiques of the positivist critique of psychoanalysis. And rather than taking the positivist model as prescriptive in saying that the human sciences should model themselves on the natural sciences, they thought that psychoanalysis, if you understood psychoanalysis properly, it could be used to criticize a positivist conception of the human sciences. So the arguments which we've been hearing since the beginning, that psychoanalysis isn't scientific, is based on the old positivist model of science, which I would argue has been discredited. And I would also argue, as I just said, that following Habermas and Ricoeur, that not psychoanalysis as it was understood by Freud, but if we looked at what Freud did rather than what he said, we can start to formulate a critique of positivist conception of science. You know, Habermas referred to Freud's scientistic self-misunderstanding, and it's a typically Habermasian formulation. But Habermas tried to show how Freud's own scientistic misunderstanding was in fact a misunderstanding, and that there's a much more acceptable interpretation of psychoanalysis, which not only avoids the criticisms of the positivists, but in fact turns the table on the positivists.
Oh, very interesting.
Yeah, an enormously important book for me along the way is Paul Ricoeur's Freud and Philosophy, which I take it isn't read very much anymore. But I think it's one of the most crucial books in this whole discussion.
Okay, see, no, I haven't heard or read it about either, so thank you for that.
Yeah.
So, yeah, go ahead.
No, actually, yeah, I mean, I was gonna segue to my questions about hermeneutics of suspicions, which is Paul Ricoeur's thing. But before that, I thought maybe you want to tell us about your criticism of Freud, or how Freud should be evolved, like how should be used these days.
First of all, I mean, the criticisms of Freud by the feminists, by the gay community, by political progressive, a lot of them are well-founded. Freud said some very awful and embarrassing things about women in particular. His treatment of the Emma Eckstein case is a scandal, something all the feminists pointed. So I don't want to deny any of those social and political criticism. If you said you're beginning to read my Freud biography, I mean, my strategy there is, I take a distinction that Hans Lowald makes between the official Freud and the unofficial Freud, and sort of use the unofficial Freud to criticize the official Freud. And Freud, the official Freud, was the Freud of the Oedipus complex, and which occurs in the third, fourth, fifth years of life. And he admitted this, that he really wasn't very good at understanding pre-Oedipal experience, and understanding the what happens in the first 3 years of life. And one of my main arguments in the biography is to try and explain why he couldn't really enter into and take up early experience. And so against him, I find the work of Winnicott, the English analyst D.W. Winnicott, very useful. And Winnicott says his position is not to reject Freud, but to complete his work. And he said Freud's theory begins at, say, the age of 3, when a unit self has been formed, when there is a self with a distinction between the inside and the outside, when a differentiated unit self can interact with other unit selves, when the unit self has a structure, a superego, an ego, and so Freud's theory applies after the unit self has been formed. What Winnicott provides is a theory of the genesis of the unit self. What happens between ages 0 and 3, so that separation individuation process takes place, a unit self is formed. And whereas for Freud, the role of the Oedipal father is central, for Winnicott, the role of the early mother is central. And probably the most important thing that's happened after Freud's death, and I go into this in detail in my book, is what's called the pre-Oedipal turn, and Winnicott is one of the prime representatives, which is to say analysts have become very interested in the early infant-mother relationship, the development of the self, and all those sorts of things. So my project has sort of been to take everything that has resulted from the pre-Oedipal turn and to use it not just to reevaluate psychoanalytic theory, but to reevaluate the way the Frankfurt School appropriated Freud.
So Martin, I thought with you, we didn't want to go all from the beginning of the Frankfurt School, but I thought before we get into the questions, you could perhaps tell us a little bit what you think are perhaps the most fascinating aspects about the Frankfurt School or some of their main contributions.
This is a really hard question to give a soundbite answer to, precisely because the Frankfurt School was critical of the idea of condensing difficult thoughts into simple formulations. And so I would say, with a great caveat to begin with, that the Frankfurt School is not absolutely coherent. It doesn't have, even though the name school suggests it does, a kind of, let's say, curriculum with a mentor who runs the show. It basically is, and I would use the title of Herbert Marcuse's Festschrift, the critical spirit that informs a wide variety of approaches to what we might call the ongoing crisis of Western culture. More broadly than mere capitalism, Western culture going all the way back, they would argue, to the dialectic of Enlightenment that begins with the domination of nature in a very early moment in the rise of human civilization. So it has great ambitions. It has lots of, I would say, targets. It has lots of theoretical impulses coursing through it, Marxism being the most obvious, but by no means the only one. And it has had several generations, so that any attempt to talk about the Frankfurt School comes up against the fact that it is an ongoing project with at least 3, perhaps 4 generations of theorists who have developed it in different ways. The other thing that I think has been most exciting about the Frankfurt School, it's now, 50 years since I first got involved, is the extent to which it has exfoliated over those decades into an international movement with many contributions from outside of Europe and the United States, so that one has to really be very careful about giving an essential version of critical theory because it has taken on so many different discourses, post-colonial, gender, queer studies, things that were not there at the beginning and that nonetheless have been enfolded into, although often with some tension, the earlier contributions. So having, in a way, evaded your question in that way, I think what I want to do is give a sense of critical theory as not something that can be simply condensed. And one of the great, I would say, ironic stories is that in the past, now it's about 15 or 20 years, the Frankfurt School has been condensed in precisely this way, as a right-wing meme. That is to say, the ways in which the Frankfurt School now has appeared in YouTube after YouTube presentation and a slew of absolutely terrible books as a kind of boogeyman for all of the evils, as they see it, of contemporary woke culture. So the Frankfurt School has, in fact, been a kind of a scapegoat in a way that I would like to avoid by also ducking the question of how we can simply reduce it to a series of specific elements or principles. I mean, the Frankfurt School meme does precisely that. They even have a list of what they call the 11, I think, or 10 or 11 principles of the Frankfurt School, very few of which have anything whatsoever to do with the actual historical Frankfurt School. So in a way, my plea here is to go slow when it comes to making sense of them. Read the original works if you can, but even the secondary sources like my own, and then you'll see the variety and the heterogeneity of the critical spirit, as I've described it, rather than reducing it to a few formulaic principles.
No, I mean, you're definitely right. I mean, especially us right now, I guess we're going to kind of focus on Marcuse and a little bit of Adorno, although there are some other questions, but you're right. I mean, there are just the fact that all the generations and the most recent ones, of course, and they're still continuing their work and going into different branches. And so perhaps we can get a little bit more into these questions. I mean, I personally came across Marcuse first at university with Eros and Civilizations, and I really, really enjoyed that book. But as well, now as I'm trying to read some Adorno and other works of theirs, and I've seen that when it comes to Freud, apparently they didn't all have the same relation, or throughout even the first 30 years, or thinking how they should include psychoanalysis. And just to be, I guess, fully transparent, even in Eros and Civilization, which is so based heavily on some of the concepts of Freud, I sometimes don't see personally too much the value of it in a way. And I could see that how if you just stuck to more just to Marxism, that could have also done the trick. So just what do you think perhaps about including Freud and then mixing it alongside the other social science disciplines?
Well, this is also a great question. I mean, it begins the Frankfurt School's use of Freud essentially with the coming of Erich Fromm to the Institute. Fromm, who had been friendly with Theo Lowenthal and knew several of the other members, joined the Institute in its earliest years and continued until the very late 30s when they the Institute had a kind of quarrel with him and he left. Basically, his interest in Freud, although he later watered it down, was an interest in the psychological mechanisms that helped to nurture or prevented the creation of a class-conscious working class. In the late 1920s, he was involved in a project survey which attempted to look at the revolutionary mindset of the workers, who theoretically were supposed to be radically militant, but practically were far more ambivalent. And he discovered, using techniques which perhaps were cruder than the ones that we would now feel as social scientists were appropriate, he discovered that they were far less psychologically prepared to be as rebellious as they had purported to be. And that therefore they were unlikely, at least in Germany, to produce the kind of resistance to Nazism or to fascism, broadly speaking, that was needed at the time. So one of the initial, I would say, uses of of Freud in critical theory was to explain the reluctance of the working class to fulfill its historical role, one assigned to it by Marxism. And the later studies of the authoritarian personality grew out of this understanding of the difference between ideological or, let's say, public discursive proclamations of the position and the deeper psychological workings of a let's say, negative or resistant kind. They were also very interested in the mediating role that the family played in moving from capitalism to the individual. That is to say, there was not simply a direct relationship between the ways in which the mode of production operated and individual behavior, but rather the bourgeois family in particular played a mediating role. Now, oddly, that mediating role was one that nurtured personalities that could in fact find some sort of resources to resist capitalism as well as perhaps be, let's say, assimilated into it. And they worried about the erosion of the traditional family in producing that kind of resistance. So the family, as what was later called a haven in a heartless world, was in fact in danger. And even the role of the patriarchal father, the strong father who could be both distant and patriarchal in a bad sense, but also a source of a kind of, let's say, ego ideal, a strong individualism, a strong sense of personal let's say, resilience, that was also being endangered. And the fear was that the erosion of the bourgeois family meant that both the state and capitalist relations through the marketplace, through advertising, whatever, could permeate the individual, robbing him or her of a kind of potential for resistance. So that was one of the sources of their interest in Freud. There were others as well, and one of them you've already mentioned, I'll jump to this, in Eros and Civilization, is the idea that in psychoanalysis, in Freud at least, there were certain, let's say, hints of what true emancipation would look like. It was not simply emancipation from economic exploitation, from inequality, but also an emancipation which took seriously the claims of the body, the claims of desire, the claims of libido, the claims, in other words, of pleasure and happiness. And the Frankfurt School is always opposed to the ascetic current in Marxism, the current that said, well, we have to wait, we have to basically keep ourselves under control so that we can make a revolution. We have to deny. One that stressed productivism rather than consumerism, one that stressed the body as a weapon in a militant struggle rather than the body as a site of pleasure. So Eros and Civilization comes to the culmination of one thread in the Frankfurt School's use of Freud, which is the thread that stresses the rights, we might say, the needs of the body, the pleasure of the body, not sublimated, not distracted from its basic, let's say, needs or desires, but rather really fulfilled in a utopian way. So the Eros was part of the revolution. Eros was not something that was irrelevant to the revolution, but was ultimately at least part of its goal. And this also, Eros and Civilization also introduced a concept which was there in the Frankfurt School's work before, which is that of repressive desublimation. So yes, the body needs to be desublimated ultimately, but it also can be desublimated. That is, it can lose its sense of constraint in a channeled way in the service of a kind of, let's say, immediate gratification. And capitalism was clever enough to benefit from repressive desublimation, in which the immediate gratification, let's call it the Playboy philosophy, a la Hugh Hefner, could become a tool in the maintenance of the system rather than in the service of its undermining. So these were a number of the ways in which Frankfurt School interest in psychoanalysis developed. Now, what they did not like, Adorno in particular, was the role of therapy. So unlike, this is a very interesting dimension of it. Marx had argued for the unity of theory and practice. Freud also argued in a way for the unity of psychoanalytic theory and therapeutic practice. The hope was that individuals could be, quote, cured, or at least the neuroses could be dealt with through the application of psychoanalytic therapeutic techniques, which were rooted in the theory. The Frankfurt School was always very, let's say, reluctant to argue for the immediate unity of theory and practice. Ultimately, perhaps in the long run, yes, but not in the moment. So Marxist theory and revolutionary practice, radical theory and militant politics did not, in their understanding, necessarily go together in the present, that rushing the link was a mistake. And the same thing, in a parallel way, was true of their attitude towards psychoanalysis. So Adorno in particular was very hostile to the idea of therapy in the present, disliked the Freudian model of the cure because he thought it basically meant adjustment to the status quo. It meant making people happy in a kind of superficial way, making them, somehow able to deal with their neuroses, rather than looking at the larger psychosocial forces that created unhappiness in individuals. So these are various ways. I could go on and on. Another obvious way in which critical theory used psychoanalysis is the discovery or the discussion of the so-called authoritarian personality, which sometimes was taken. This was a work done in the late 1940s, published in 1950, trying to come up with a neutral technique, the F scale, to measure people's latent authoritarianism. It was sometimes argued that it was a concession entirely to psychological rather than social explanations of authoritarianism. Adorno and others argued against this, that it was basically social forces that permeated the individual, creating authoritarian personalities rather than anything latent in the psyche per se. But having said that, they understood that these social forces could use the techniques of psychological, let's say, I don't know what, psychological manipulation to create personalities that would be basically acquiescent in either, let's say, political or social conformity. So there was a kind of complicated relation between the social and the psychological, between sociology and psychology, between Marx and Freud. All of these, I mean, the metaphor of the marriage is often used. It was a marriage that was often, as marriages can be, contested. It was not simply harmonious. There was a sense of each of them bringing something to the table, but not producing a simple reconciliation, largely because the world they tried to make sense of was a world which was itself contested, contradictory, unreconciled, irreducible to a harmonistic totality. So the methods you used needed somehow to reflect precisely that tension. And psychoanalysis, therefore, was part of the mix, but was never fully and completely folded into a totally coherent and totally smooth theory.
I see that's very interesting. I mean, what you said about Adorno, that was also interesting, adjusting to the status quo through therapy. But I don't know if Sam has any follow-up questions. But in the beginning, you spoke about family, and then I just want to come back about authoritarian figures. But the family aspect, I had never heard about that. So I was wondering if you could just elaborate on that again, please.
Well, this is also historical. That is to say, it's not the family per se, but the bourgeois family, which emerges at a certain point in history, and then is under siege, which becomes permeated, we might say, by social forces which prevent it from being an enclave. The enclave theory is quite interesting. And Adorno himself, this is often, one of the things that explains his life history. Adorno had a very happy childhood, a nurtured childhood. He was a single child in a family with basically two mothers. His aunt, Agatha, was part of the larger family. And they spoiled him rotten. He was extraordinarily well taken care of. Everybody really loved him. Everybody really made a little utopia for him. And he often reflected on childhood as a moment of lost paradise. Walter Benjamin also, although he had much more difficulty with his parents ultimately, had very positive feelings about childhood. So one aspect of the family is the space in which happy childhoods can take place. Now, of course, we know that this is not true of every family. We also know that not every family is a single, mommy, daddy, spoiled children, nuclear, let's say, organization. Its families have many different forms. But this model of the family as a kind of enclave before the child has to become an adult and go out into the world is sometimes seen as a source of a kind of utopia. Now, as I say, it's not universal. There's something idealized about it and so forth. The other utopia, interestingly enough, and I recently wrote about this in the introduction to a book that came out in German of the materials that are left behind by Marcuse and Leo Löwenthal. The other utopia was friendship. So the model of friendship, which is not the model of kin, but the model, we might say, of kith, of a certain kind of relationship that is not impersonal, that is not transactional, a relationship that is one without desire, in the way sometimes love relationships are. The relationship of friendship is also, to a certain extent, a relationship that has utopian dimensions. And the Frankfurt School had, in fact, in its history, several extraordinary friendships. I mean, Horkheimer and Friedrich Pollock had a friendship pact that they wrote when they were very young, which they kept to throughout their entire life. They lived near the end of their lives in adjoining homes in Montagnola in Switzerland, remained friends throughout. Marcuse and Lowenthal, Marcuse and Franz Neumann, Horkheimer and Adorno. These were deep and really important friendships, not without some tensions occasionally, but still able basically to prefigure a kind of state of relationships that would be positive. So the family, in a certain respect, certain, let's say historical constraints, the possibility of friendship, all of these represented ways of avoiding the public relationships, which relationships of exchange, relationships of instrumental reason, relationships that were transactional in the larger capitalist world into which we were, in a sense, thrust after we left the family, after we were thrown out into the world of getting and spending. So that was, I think, one of the sources of their, let's say, complicated relationship to what was being lost in the modern world and what could be seen as a resistant residue against the total permeation of all human relations by what they saw as the alienation and reification of capitalism.
Okay, all right. So that was it for this episode. As I've already mentioned, you can go watch the full interviews with all the interviews who feature in our series. Links to that and links to other other videos and parts related to Frankfurt School. Everything is down in the description box below. So again, thank you for watching. Our next few episodes now, we're really going to dive in, and each episode is going to be dedicated to one of the big Frankfurt School thinkers. So Marcuse, Horkheimer, Adorno, and etc. And yes, so please leave your comments, questions, criticisms, and everything else down below. We'll make sure to get to them. If not, thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe, and we'll see you in our next video. Thank you.